Hello, and welcome back to the Rose Political Podcast. My name is Alejandro Ramos, and I am your host. For today's episode, we have a little bit of a different spin on what we typically do. We have a forum hosted by the Commission on Campus Civic Engagement here at Sacred Heart University, and it's part of this talk is part of the Ramos Rose Political Speaker Series, which aims at bringing in high-profile candidates as well as elected officials to campus. The first installment of this political series was Senator Richard Blumenthal, U.S. Senator here from Connecticut. We hope you enjoy this episode, and we'll see you next time.
Okay, folks, I think we're about ready to begin. If we could take our seats here, please. All right, well, welcome everyone to what is the first in a series of discussions with very distinguished public servants here in Connecticut. And for those of you who are from Connecticut, I'm sure you realize that today's guest really doesn't need any introduction because he has been, I am a resident of Connecticut my whole life, he has been in many ways a household name here in Connecticut for decades. And I'm so proud today to introduce our speaker, or our guest, I should say, who is a United States Senator. And let me tell you a little bit about Senator Blumenthal. He started as a state lawmaker, a very distinguished state lawmaker up in Hartford. And he also served as a United States attorney for a while. And then I believe it was for 20 years you served as Attorney General here in the state of Connecticut. And then from the Attorney General's position, he ran for the U.S. Senate. And his very first race for U.S. Senate was against someone that we know quite well here in Connecticut, I believe, Linda McMahon, and of course he won. And then he won for a second term, and today, right now, he's just starting his third term in the U.S. Senate, and a very distinguished senator, for sure. I'm sure you've seen him on television often speaking to the press in Washington, D.C. and here in Connecticut. If I'm correct as far as his committee assignments, correct me if I'm wrong, but the last time I looked on your website, you are a member of the Senate Judiciary Committee, you are on the Armed Services Committee, you are on the Veterans Affairs Committee, and I believe you're also on Science and Technology. Is that still correct?
Actually, I am now on the Homeland Security and Government Operations Committee.
So you're on that committee as well?
And
All right.
chairman of the subcommittee there. It's called the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations.
All right.
Which is a wide-ranging investigative subcommittee.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Yeah, so he's in his third term as Senate now, and he was over in Munich at a very important conference a little while ago. And today he's going to be speaking on several issues which Alejandro Ramos is going to introduce in a moment. So without taking up more time, would you please give a nice warm Sacred Heart welcome for our distinguished guest today, Senator Dick Blumenthal.
Okay. Thank you again. Thank you again, Senator, for being here today. We have a few topics that we would like to run through. Just for you to know, I know there's two full classes here. One is senior seminar, which is Dr. Rose's class, and then we have an international relations class with Professor Akbalut. I don't know where she is. Oh, there she is. Hi, Professor Akbalut. So we have students that are very interested in foreign affairs, and I know that this is something of a specialty of yours. So for our first topic, we're going to talk about Ukraine, and how much should we continue to support Ukraine? I know the president was just in Ukraine, and we gave another $500 million to them to continue to support them. How much should we continue to do so? And is there really ever a time that we should say enough is enough and no longer support this effort?
Well, thank you for having me, both Dr. Rose and you, Mr. Ramos, and to all of the Sacred Heart community. I'm really honored and delighted to be back. I've been at Sacred Heart many times, and I'm a big admirer and a fan of this school. It is such a great institution. It's growing, and it provides great students, great graduates to Connecticut. Very, very proud to be here again. And just want to say I visited Ukraine for the third time in less than a year, in Kyiv for the third time just recently, about 4 weeks ago, and met again with President Zelensky. So to answer your question very directly, I've been one of the leaders of our assisting Ukraine going back to literally 2014. 2014, when Russia first invaded Ukraine. It took Crimea, it took the Donbas region, Donetsk and Luhansk, and that's where the battle is now occurring. But the idea that the invasion occurred a year ago, yes, it did, the latest sort of invading action. But this history of Russia, the Soviet Union, trying to subjugate Ukraine, as you know, as students of history, international relations, goes back literally centuries. And if you want to read a book about in effect, the history of murder and genocide in that part of the world, I would recommend a book by Timothy Snyder. He's a professor at Yale. It's called Bloodlands. And it is a very graphic and powerful description of the history of war crimes, literally war crimes, Soviet war crimes, German war crimes, Nazis, Stalin, Hitler. And so there's that historical background. I think we should provide Ukraine with whatever it needs, as long as it takes, and more quickly. I believe that the fight in Ukraine is not just about Ukraine. It's about NATO. It is about our freedom and democracy, because what Putin wants is to disrupt and divide Western democracy. He wants to reestablish the old Soviet Union, the Russian Empire. He said it. He's doing it. He will keep going. Right now, we should not have troops on the ground. Zelensky doesn't want them and doesn't need them if we give him the weapons to do the job himself. And so we've provided those weapons. I give a lot of credit to President Biden, who was there just 24 hours ago, virtually, and who spoke just a couple of hours ago in Poland, because President Biden has committed those weapons, the Javelins and Stingers, which go against tanks and aircraft held on the shoulders of people who fire them, the long-range artillery, HIMARS, that have been crucial, absolutely crucial, in retaking Kherson and pushing Russians back and holding them back at Bakhmut. The armored vehicles, I was in Germany just a day ago. I came back last night, watching training of those Ukrainian troops on Bradley armored vehicles. Very, very inspiring to see. And the tanks that we will be providing. Germans providing Leopard 2 tanks, English providing the Challengers, we're providing the Abrams M1 tanks. But we've provided that equipment always with a delay, in my view. I have pushed for quicker, speedier provision of those kinds of weapon systems, including the Patriot air raid system. When I was there the last time, there were air sirens. We saw the buildings that have been destroyed in Kyiv. They live under this reign of terror. We should be providing more air defense and more drones. And we have been winning this war, make no mistake. As President Biden said, the Russians are losing and they will never win. Because Putin's objective, remember, Putin's objective was to take the whole country, to conquer. When I was in Kyiv, we went to a town called Bucha, which is right outside of Kyiv. In fact, it's about 15 minutes by car. That's where the Russians were stopped. 15 minutes away from where President Zelensky has his bunker, his headquarters. That's how close they came. And in Bucha, we saw the mass graves, where women and children had their hands tied behind their back. They were shot in the head, hundreds of them, which is in keeping with that history that I mentioned. It's not an aberration. It's what the Soviets did, it's what the Russians did under Stalin. This is a country that has fought for its independence, a people who have fought to defend their culture. When the Russians wanted to abolish their language, force them to worship in Russian rather than Ukrainian, have their Bibles printed in Russian, not Ukrainian. It is part of a pattern. And so when people say, well, we should have negotiations, my reaction is negotiations when President Zelensky wants to negotiate. And what President Zelensky will say, if you ask him, and I'll just finish on this note, when you ask him, what does victory look like? He will tell you, pushing the Russians out of Ukraine, including Crimea. Going back to the borders that existed in 1994. Why 1994? Because at that point, Ukraine had territorial integrity, and I'm sure there are very few people in this room who remember this point. In 1994, Ukraine had nuclear weapons. It literally had nuclear warheads. It gave them up on the condition that its territorial integrity be guaranteed. That's an obligation that we need to recognize. And President Zelensky, you know, again, going back to 1 year ago, almost to the day, this coming Friday, that's when the invasion began. You'll remember? How many days did they give him before Kyiv would be overrun? About 3-4 days. The forces coming down from Belarus were expected to overrun Kyiv in 3 or 4 days. Our military said so. The Ukrainians have been consistently underestimated. Consistently underestimated. They have proved to be fierce and courageous, as you would expect, because they're fighting for their homeland. They're fighting for their independence and freedom. They know what's at stake. And when I saw those Ukrainians being trained at our army base in Germany, and I met many of them, you know what they were doing a year ago? One was a baker, another computer programmer, a warehouse employee. These are not professional military. They're volunteering because they want to fight for their country, and they're being trained to fight for their country on the Bradley armored vehicles and other weapon systems, and they will use everything we can give them. So we should be helping them as long and hard as it takes.
Thank you, Senator. You know, to follow up on a point that you made, that you wish that we could be doing things quicker and that we could be doing more, do you feel that President Biden has been doing enough to support this effort and getting everything to Ukraine in a timely manner?
I think President Biden has been advised by his military leaders to be cautious for a number of reasons. First of all, there's the fear of Putin escalating, mainly using tactical nuclear weapons. That's a legitimate fear. But it's been largely, I think, diminished over this past year. Putin yesterday, I think it is now in Russian time, gave his State of the Nation speech. He said he was withdrawing participation in the START Treaty, which is very unfortunate and reprehensible. But there was no mention of tactical nuclear weapons, as he has done before. I think that fear has largely been dissipated, but it was a legitimate fear maybe a year ago. There's a concern about training. What I saw in Grafenwohr at the U.S. Army base Bavaria dissipated any apprehension in my mind about the difficulty of training. These Ukrainians, as one of the officers put it to me, our officers, are quick learners. They are quick learners because they know what's at stake. So I think President Biden has provided what's needed, and I commend him for it. Some of our military leaders have urged more caution. I think now, and here's the key point I would make about weapons, we have to provide them with fighter aircraft. Why? Because those fighter aircraft are key to destroying some of the missile batteries, some of their artillery and their missile systems that are conducting a reign of terror on Ukraine's infrastructure. They're knocking out electricity, as you know, you've seen it. They're hitting civilian targets, hospitals, schools, housing. And so those planes are necessary. They require training. When I was at the Munich Security Conference, what I heard was we should begin the training right away for the pilots. The British have already begun providing that training. We should do the same. So I think President Biden has done the right thing, maybe a little more slowly than I would have liked.
Thank you, Senator. To move into our next topic, which is Taiwan, how should the U.S. respond to a possible Chinese invasion of Taiwan, if it were to ever to occur?
Let me make a point about Taiwan and Ukraine. The two are related. I think the NATO unity on Ukraine, the steadfastness of the United States' commitment in Ukraine, the passion of President Biden, you saw it when he visited. And the speech that he gave just hours ago, very eloquent. We will not waver, is giving Xi a lesson. There's every reason to be concerned about Taiwan because the Chinese have said they're going to take it back. Just a question of when. I think we've given them a lot of reason to think twice, three times again. We should be doing, in the meantime, what we are now doing, which is provide weapon systems to Taiwan that it can use, as the saying goes, to turn itself into a kind of porcupine. And many of you are probably familiar with this strategy. If you turn it into a porcupine, very difficult to swallow. If China calculates that its losses would be so high militarily that it's not worth doing, it will hold off. And I think, in addition, if the costs include economic disruption, you know, if China tries to take Taiwan, it has to deal not only with the United States, but also Japan, Australia, our allies in the Pacific. I do think we need to turn to the Pacific. I am sure that the State Department and President Biden wish we had done it before now. That was the strategy before Putin invaded, that we would turn to the Pacific. Absolutely right. China, in the long run, is our main competitor. I'll be polite, our main competitor, an adversary, economically, militarily, politically, much stronger than Russia, as you all know. My colleague, Senator McCain, I used to travel with McCain a lot. He was a very good friend, former chairman of the Armed Services Committee where I served. Used to say that Russia is a gigantic gasoline station with nuclear arms run by gangsters. Its only export, real export, is energy, natural gas, fuel. Its gross domestic product is about the size of what? Italy's, Mexico's, and it's run by oligarchs and kleptocrats. Our cause in Taiwan, like Ukraine, must be bipartisan. When I have visited Ukraine, Kyiv, 3 times, met with President Zelensky, including in this country, always bipartisan. I went to Ukraine most recently with Senator Graham of South Carolina and Senator Whitehouse of Rhode Island. We have sponsored a resolution to declare Russia a state sponsor of terrorism, bipartisan. This cause has been bipartisan, and so should be our attempt to dissuade China from invading Taiwan.
Thank you, Senator. Now that we touched upon these 2 topics, other than democracy, what is the real importance of defending both Ukraine and Taiwan?
Well, other than democracy, I'm tempted to say, is there anything more important? Because it's not just their democracy, it's our democracy. And if you have any doubts about that, by the way, you should talk to some of our NATO allies. I spoke to the Prime Minister of Finland, Sweden, Estonia. We met with representatives of Poland. I visited with the Defense Minister of Poland. You're hearing what the President of Poland is saying. They're on the front line against Putin. It's not just Ukraine's democracy. It's our democracy, too. Putin has an agenda, not particularly hidden, of disrupting Western democracies. He did it in 2016, or attempted to do it, using cyber. They'll use any means available. Cyber, space, the old-fashioned kind of World War II or World War I military tactics that we see right now in eastern Ukraine. But he will keep rolling, militarily and politically. So it is our democracy that's at stake. But at the same time, there is this thing called the rule of law. So when we talk about democracy, I think maybe rule of law, pretty important too. The world order has been totally disrupted by Putin. He's saying, the way we've done things since World War II, forget about it. And as much as we're worried about the kind of military political strategy here, there are values at stake, and there is the future of our democracy. And economically, there's also the freedom of trade, of economic relationships that are important. Ukraine is in many respects the world's breadbasket. When Stalin starved Ukraine in 1933, he took the grain to feed his own people. Ukraine is rich in soybeans, corn, wheat. Many parts of the world are in danger of famine now because of the disruption of exports from Ukraine. So there is a lot of economic policy at stake too.
Let me just ask a question here also, kind of a follow-up. There's often a lot of talk about mission creep. As we start providing aid, now we're giving Abrams tanks and so forth to Ukraine. And then with the issue in Taiwan, we're giving more aid there. And there are many who are concerned that eventually the United States military will be drawn into these conflicts. And so, as a member of the Armed Services Committee, how does our military look these days, in your view, in terms of viability?
Our military is the strongest in the world. We're the only power that can project military force to any part of the world. China can dominate or seek to dominate its region, not really dominate, because right now, in terms of undersea warfare, aircraft carrier, air superiority, we actually are superior to China, even in its own sphere, but China can't project to Ukraine. Russia can't project its force to the South China Sea. Neither of them can really be a force in the Middle East. We're the only power that can project military force in that overwhelming strength. But we need to be careful about overspending, about waste. We need to trim some weapons systems platform, a real challenge. The National Defense Authorization Act will be coming again, and there's no question that we will need to apply a very sharp lens. Mission creep, really a separate topic. And let me repeat, no troops on the ground in Ukraine. And again, to repeat, Zelensky hasn't asked for them. He's asked for a lot, but no troops. We should not put troops on the ground. The best way to avoid troops becoming embroiled in Europe, US troops, is to win in Ukraine. He is fighting our fight. They're fighting our fight with their blood, their lives, and frankly, the infrastructure of their country, which we will need to reconstruct. But there is a strong consensus, our military, ourselves, as political elected leaders, that there should be no troops in Ukraine. So I don't think there's a danger of mission creep just because we are providing the weapon systems that he needs to win.
So we had one final topic of a domestic issue with the debt ceiling, but I think at this time it would be a good time to have students ask questions so that they could have their questions answered. So if anyone has a question, please raise your hand and Dr. Rose will bring the mic to you.
Okay. Anthony, here, I'm going to hand the mic to you so everybody can hear you. Okay. Here you go.
So this is a several-part question. Why are you voting to fund what could easily become a nuclear war in Ukraine and the destruction of every single life on Earth? Why are you supporting a proxy war with the biggest nuclear power on Earth? And let me just explain something. Preventing nuclear war is not a left versus right issue. Why aren't you, Senator Blumenthal, pushing for peace negotiations between Ukraine and Russia so we can finally end this horrific war? And why are you in the pockets of the military-industrial complex, allowing companies like Raytheon to make billions off of human suffering happening overseas in Ukraine?
Well, that's definitely a multi-part question. And I will try to address it as concisely as possible. You're right that Russia probably has more nuclear warheads, and there was apprehension initially about Putin possibly using tactical nuclear arms. And I think he has learned a lesson, which is if he uses tactical nuclear arms, he will have all of NATO coming at him. So I think that danger has been dissipated, but we need to be aware of it, no question. Just as before Ukraine, before this invasion, before any of the recent developments, there was still the danger of nuclear war. And frankly, there is still the danger that a country like Pakistan or India or North Korea could precipitate some nuclear conflagration, which is why I've advocated for treaties like the START Treaty, which unfortunately Putin has now said he's going to suspend participation in. So I agree with you about the danger of nuclear escalation. I think it has diminished over this past year. In terms of our support for Ukraine, it actually is a way to avoid nuclear confrontation, because the reason why Putin, I think, is less eager to, and he never was eager, but more reluctant even to talk about the use of nuclear arms, is he has seen our resolve. He is let me put it bluntly, he's a KGB thug. He understands military force. Like any tyrant, any dictator, any aggressor, Hitler, Stalin, he understands military force, and we're showing it to him. That's what causes people like Khrushchev to back down, as he did in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I think that we've learned from history, if we don't stand up to a bully, they'll just keep going. So I actually think that Ukraine fighting conventional, it's almost like World War I, trench warfare, and winning it is a better way to stop possible nuclear conflagration. And I'm not sure about the question of Raytheon, how we got to Raytheon. I'm a supporter of smart defense spending, strategic defense spending, submarines made by Electric Boat, which is General Dynamics, helicopters made by Sikorsky, which is Lockheed. Those are the two main Connecticut defense manufacturers, and we're fortunate to have them here, but we're also fortunate to have the best submarines, stealthy, strong, versatile, best helicopters made in Connecticut. Pratt & Whitney makes the engines for the F-35. But we need to be mindful, and I think this goes to your question about the debt ceiling. We need to be mindful about the limits on our resources and about the domestic needs, which I've also advocated. So we're going to have to look at our defense budget next time around. The debt ceiling should be raised. We have to raise the debt ceiling. It should be addressed separately from the budget, where there may be a need to reduce spending on some of those weapon systems.
I believe, Ben, you had a question? And then we'll get to Alex over here.
Senator Blumenthal, first let me say it's a great pleasure to have you at our university. My question kind of pertains to what we were discussing to you about NATO's involvement in the Ukraine situation. What are your thoughts on inducting Ukraine into the NATO alliance?
What are my thoughts about having Ukraine as a NATO member?
Yes.
Well, the first step would be to make it a member of the European Union, which I think should happen as rapidly as possible. Second, Finland and Sweden have applied to be NATO members. I think they should be admitted as quickly as possible. Erdogan is, in effect, blocking Sweden. He says, okay to Finland, but not Sweden. I think he has to be persuaded to get out of the way. And I think some kind of guarantee for Ukraine should be part of whatever negotiated settlement there is at the right time. I'm not against negotiation. Let me just be clear in answer to the previous question as well. And thank you for your question. I just think negotiations that give Putin a ceasefire where he can rebuild his forces without any guarantee that he won't do the same again is really unavailing. And ultimately, there has to be a guarantee to Ukraine that is airtight to its territorial integrity. Now, that could be NATO, but it also could be some other kind of guarantee. I think Ukraine has, at the end of this conflict, every right to be part of NATO. I probably would support it. But the important point is to make sure that there is an ironclad guarantee that Putin knows that, again, if he comes at Ukraine after a temporary, call it a ceasefire or a temporary interregnum, that he will be hit again by the full force of NATO. And that's what NATO does. By the way, Article 5, you know what Article 5 does. It says, in effect, you attacked one nation in NATO, all of NATO, including the United States, will be on you.
Alex?
Hi. So my question doesn't have to really do with Ukraine. I'm going to kind of go on towards your stance on privacy. So I was wondering how you felt about having bipartisan support on your Kids Online Safety Act that you sponsor, and since the bill is being reintroduced this year, what we could expect from it if it does pass.
So glad you asked about it. A little break from Ukraine. For the benefit of a lot of folks who may not know what the Kids Online Safety Act is, I introduced this measure last year after you may be very, very familiar with this topic, after I and Republicans on the Commerce Committee, where I served at the time, had hearings. We had 5 hearings of the subcommittee I chaired, Consumer Protection Subcommittee. Senator Blackburn, Republican of Tennessee, and I introduced a measure that gives kids and parents better protections. In effect, the right to disconnect from the algorithms, put safeguards on online companies, make them liable, make them legally accountable for harm that's done, the bullying, the eating disorder content driven to kids by the algorithms, black box algorithms, no one knows how they work. Kids Online Safety Act, basically to protect children online from some of the excesses and abuses. And I'm very optimistic that we'll have bipartisan support again. This bill was voted out of the Commerce Committee unanimously. That's pretty uncommon, unanimously. So strong bipartisan support. Senator Blackburn and I are going to reintroduce it. And I think it's very important to protect privacy. Right now, you know, for big tech, you're the product. You're the product. You're the source of information that they sell. They sell it to advertisers. That's the way they make their money. And kids are the product. So I've introduced a series of measures. We introduced a bipartisan measure to protect against human trafficking, which was passed, signed by President Trump. Senator Graham and I introduced a measure called the Earn It Act, protect against misuse of information for pornography, child images online, protect against the abuses and excesses online from big tech. So this is an ongoing effort, and I will be continuing it. Even though I'm no longer on the Commerce Committee, I'll be continuing to work on it with Senator Blackburn and others who have an interest in it. And it's important to the future of our country, and particularly important to the future of children.
Thank you.
Question up there.
Kind of going off of that, I was just wondering, because I know a few years back, big companies like YouTube and things like that had issues with targeting ads toward children. And what's the difference between child-targeted ads versus more or less, I'm trying to figure out how to say this, sorry, for toy products versus other products that I often see, like booze and things like that on most YouTube ads and things like that?
Thanks for that question. Here's what I think is really important about the internet that a lot of people don't know. There is a part of our law, it's called Section 230. It's part of the Communications Decency Act, which gives big tech, all of those companies, no matter how big they are, in effect, absolute protection against any legal accountability. So for all those ads, they have no incentive to protect kids. They have a shield of immunity. If you're harmed by something that appears online, you have no right to go against Google, Amazon, YouTube, Facebook, any of those companies, Meta, which now of course owns Facebook and other companies, you have no right to hold them accountable. And so to take an example, we had testimony just last week from some of the parents who have lost children to suicide as a result of that content online. Kristen Bride talked about her son Carson, who was bullied online. Now, ads may be seemingly different, but still, neither Mrs. Bride nor anyone else who may be affected by those ads and bad things happen to them as a result of the ads has any right to go against those big tech companies. And what we're thinking about doing is cutting back on some of that immunity, reducing the scope of Section 230. Again, in a bipartisan way. You may think I have very little in common with Senator Graham or Senator Hawley of Missouri, Republican, but we're seriously considering what more can be done to hold big tech accountable, cut back on that Section 230 immunity. Think about it for a moment. What other industry has that kind of protection? Well, the gun industry does, to an extent, under the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, known as PLACA, but they've been held accountable by the Sandy Hook families. Remington has been taken to the court, and our state Supreme Court said PLACA, as it's known, doesn't apply to marketing. So this kind of immunity we need to re-examine on a bipartisan basis.
I think we have time for just one more, and then we'll have to wrap up.
Okay, one more question. Right here. Okay.
Can you hear me? All right. So before you said that Russia's only valuable export was natural gas, I actually disagree with that statement. Russia's the global leader in natural gas, uranium, neon, processed nickel, semi-finished iron, wheat, fertilizer, and potash. All of those items are actually essential in how the global community runs and how global trade runs. So is the United States prepared to fulfill the hole that Russian industry is going to leave in the West?
Yeah, they do export some of it, but their leading export, as you know, from the concerns that Western Europe has. Their leading export has been natural gas, oil, gas.
What I'm saying is,
we're weaning ourselves away from that major export. I was somewhat exaggerating, I'll grant you. So was Senator McCain. We can find fertilizer elsewhere. We can find potash elsewhere. We can find uranium elsewhere, and we are. And we have to do it. And Europe, by the way, here's an important point for climate change as well, has been actually turning around their economies and in effect, stopping their dependence. They're doing it by actively getting liquid natural gas elsewhere, but they're also, did you notice recently they said no more sales of fossil fuel powered cars after 2035? That is a major breakthrough. We ought to do the same. California has said it's going to have that same target date. So this is a revolutionary movement that has something to do with dependence on Russian fuel, but also a goal of stopping dependence on fossil fuel powered cars, and we ought to be looking, as Germany is. I just came from Germany. If you drive through Bavaria, what you'll see is solar fields, solar energy, the kinds of solar power that we ought to be doing as well. And I mention it because Bavaria, on the day I went there, was completely overcast. If they're doing it in Bavaria, which isn't like one of the, parts of the world that have huge amounts of sunlight, but they're doing it there. They are converting to solar, to wind, to geothermal, to fuel cells. That is the future. And that's just one part of how they've become dependent on Russia, and they've resolved no more. And easier to do it on potash and uranium and those other products that in the past have been a source of exports from Russia.
Okay, well, Senator, thank you very much for your insight and detailed responses to these questions.
Well, these are great questions. Thank you.
Yes, and I want to, on behalf of the university at this point, thank you very much for coming here for your time. And I know it's very limited, and you're a very busy man. And this has been a wonderful forum and a great opportunity for our students. And one of the real central themes of our mission is to prepare students for public service. And quite frankly, I think you, in all the years, you have served the people of Connecticut. And I can speak factually about that, having lived in Connecticut my whole life. You personify in many ways the mission of our own university. So thank you very much for your time and your public service, sir. Thank you.
Well, again, I thank you, Gary Rose, who has been a great teacher, public servant. Thank you, Mr. Ramos. Thank you to Sacred Heart for giving me this opportunity to be with you. I really enjoy it. The questions are great, and I hope that I haven't worn out my welcome and I'll be invited back. And to Sacred Heart, again, just a wonderful educational institution. I'm very, very proud to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Okay.
I want to thank you all for being here with us today. As you guys know, the event is Politics and Pizza, so if you guys head out right into the lobby, there's going to be pizza for all of you.
I was going to ask, actually, where is the pizza?
Yes.
Where's the beef?
Yes. Well, before you guys head out, I do want to make a few special thank yous. Obviously, to the Senator. Thank you, Senator, for being here with us today. I want to thank Rhett from his team for emailing with me back and forth to help setting this up. But this event really couldn't have been possible without Beth Kaczynski and Jason Ebert for really helping us and making this a reality. So thank you for coming to the first installment of the Ramos Rose Political Series, and we hope to see you again.
Thank you.